Hey, welcome back, folks. This is Johnny the Historian here. Welcome back to another episode of Nationalism, the origins of the First World War. So we're going through the history of nationalism right up to this point. In this episode, we're going to talk about the revolutions of 1848, or the springtime of revolutions, or the year of revolutions, 1848, okay? This is a turning point, not just within nationalism as an ideology and a philosophy within society. It truly is with other things as well. But we're just focused on the nationalist aspect during this times of revolution. And this was actually a series of widespread, uncoordinated liberal and nationalist uprisings that happened right across Europe. Started in Sicily and France in February, and it spread to Germany and Italy and Austria, all over, well over more than 50 countries. These revolutions spread within 12 months. Some of them do spill over into 1849. And this is an interesting part in history because this is where nationalism takes on a more aggressive form. It becomes more embedded, more entrenched, and rooted within society and the people and the nationalists and the liberals at this time. It really takes off even stronger after this. Liberals actually succeed and then they fail. It's pretty interesting how this actually happens, okay? Driven by, most reasons were political and economic, and driven by the dissatisfaction of monarchies, economic crisis, the desires for constitutional governance, and movements aimed for democratic reform and change. And the failures, pretty much in a lot of senses too, into the direct divisions and repression of people, okay, in a lot of aspects. One thing I love about the revolutions is actually where it actually starts to take place, and in 1839. Okay, there's a lot of failed harvest during this time. There's a lot of drought. There's a lot of failed harvest and agricultural failure, which we know leads to economic difficulties and a crisis, but most importantly, massive starvation. Okay, so this is all happening all across Europe. All right. So this is pretty much a bad indication of a lot of things. So a lot of things start to happen during this time. So now, a lot of failed harvest, and into the 1840s, it got worse. People starved, inflation, the prices of food sky through the roof. Okay, this leads to massive migrations, as you recall. Massive migrations. One of the most famous is the Great Famine in Ireland, the Great Plato Famine, from 1845 to 1852. During those years, and this happens in the 40s, and also introduced in about it happened in 1946 and 45 as well. So that where you have this great massive migration to the New World in search of a new life, more food and abundance, right? The New World was classified as abundance, right? So to start over, you had massive migration because of that. You had massive civilized risks for the people that stayed behind and fighting, and they didn't want to go to the New World. They wanted to make the world that they were in and that they lived in and born in, better. Mind you, of an immigration crisis nowadays, right? You love your country, but you do not stay there and fight and make it a better place. Does that make one a coward? Okay, even if you look at the revolutions of 1848, you're going to start to see that a lot of migrations, people just left. They couldn't take it. They didn't want to stay and fight. They couldn't make anything from the soil. The plight episode for the Irish famine. Plight is a very deadly potato disease. It wipes out a massive amount of the crop, right? Caused a lot of problems. There was also a lot of failure, and because of the drought, there was a lot of failure in barley and wheat and potatoes were the first three major things that actually were affected by the drought and diseases at the time. And this created a lot of growing resentment, okay? Now, a lot of peasants actually left, the ones that stayed in Europe, like in instance went to Paris or Vienna. Remember, 50 countries, 50 cities, and urban centers, major urban centers across Europe are going to go into uprising. A massive flood of peasants from the country in to the city. Now, this was always continuing because this is the time of the Industrial Revolution. But this was a huge flux, bigger flux. And, well, the ideas of liberalism and socialism and nationalism really were the main catalysts behind these revolutions. Mind you, keep in mind, it's uncoordinated. This all spontaneously happens. And this is one of these things in history where it's like, whoa, how did this happen? Today, you got to go on social media, you got to organize it. Then, everybody was on the same page on a social conscience. Due to the three main reasons. You got to think of that for a second, okay? And it's pretty cool how this all came about. But we're going to look at like the key details, just a few key details over regarding this period. Now, the causes of it were pretty much mostly fueled by severe economic depression. Food shortages, drought, the rise of nationalism is what we're really going to focus on, because there's a lot of other things, the demands that you're going to see in the Austrian Empire, demands for constitutional representative governance and self-autonomy within the empire, or even break away from the empire. All right? So you had a lot of this happening in a lot of key locations. In France, it starts in February. Okay, it's the February Revolution when it comes to French history, and the abdication of King Louis Philippe, which he was disliked by the majority of French citizens. He was not too popular, and established the Second French Republic. But here's the kicker, because by 1852, they bring in Louis the Napoleon, becomes Napoleon the Third Emperor. They go back to monarchy because the Republic came in a time where it was hard for them to actually establish themselves. So much chaos that the people looked at it and be like, we don't want this government. It's not working. It's worse than before. We're going back to monarchy. This is what happens in France. Remember, we always talk to France trying to decide what they're trying to do. So that all takes place. Now, within the German states, protesters actually push a lot in German unification. And this is nationalism at its finest, okay? They want a lot of liberal constitutions. They actually resulted in the formation of the first kind of step towards a unified Germany with pretty much the Frankfurt Parliament. All these lords all over these states would come together to discuss with a solid king. This fails. Okay, this fails in time. This goes right away, and it ultimately failed in the concept of unifying Germany. It was a failed attempt, but they tried. Remember that, they tried. And the moral of that story is never give up. Lord willing. And if you're a Christian, it's in God's will if you get the job or not. And if you don't, you did your part, right? Like, how far does that go? Right? So, but one thing I really want to talk to, which really affects a lot of that towards this, all links and puts together the building blocks and the origins towards one of the main catalysts of the starting of the First World War, okay? And it really takes place in the Austrian Empire, okay? A lot of uprisings challenged imperial rule. A lot of nationalistic people and ethnic groups wanted to break away from the empire. You had the Croats, you had the Serbs, you had mostly the major ones was the Hungarians. You had at least 20 to 25% of the population of the Austrian Empire were German. What's going on in Germany? Unification. They want to be part of that, but they're stuck in the fold of the Austrian Empire. So this was very hard, and a lot of these groups were seeking massive independence from the empire. Remember, nationalism is a cancer or a leprosy, I like to say it. Taking the limbs and just taking chunks off of the empire until there's nothing left, down to the mother country. All right. It is a massive disease for any empire to fight off. Well, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire was infected by nationalism and this disease. Now the question is, were they healthy enough or able to ability to fight it off? Let's find out. You want to know? Let's know. But we're not getting there yet. Okay. Now within Italy, the Italian states, there's lots of revolts aimed to overthrow Austrian rule in lots of parts of the northern Italy. Okay. Lombardy, places like this, were owned and operated and controlled by the Austrian Empire, by the Habsburgs. So this, okay, there was a short-lived Roman Republic actually declared during this time, but this is where the French came in and pretty much ultimately crushed it. Okay. We're going to learn more about that when we get into Italian unification, but that's just the overall what takes place in 1848. Quick overview. There's a lot we're going to discuss in the Italian unification, which is one of my favorite unifications to study, next to the German, but it is amazing how everything is shifted on the board. So you're going to have to use this a little bit of imagination to picture it, I should say, and do a lot of aspects. Now usually the hard thing there about these revolts is basically the revolutions were mostly suppressed by the conservative forces by the end of 1849. Okay, now this is a period of reaction that comes after. This is a period of reaction after the revolutions and how it all come to be. Now, in everything. Now, there's no revolutions in Russia at this time. Okay? One thing that's funny is one of my favorite quotes and interesting quotes is by Tsar Nicholas I of Russia. Okay? As you know, I'm a Russian historian, and I love what he says. When he finds out what happened in France, okay, he's like, I love his quote, "Saddle up your horses, gentlemen." All right, saddle up your horses, gentlemen. The French have declared another republic. All right, the republic has already been declared in France, and this is said by Nicholas I, Tsar of Russia, and he realized what was coming. And when that actually happened during that time in February and everything following the beginning of the year of revolution, Russia's already starting to get prepared, and Nicholas is starting to prepare his armies at this time and what he's going to do in his diplomacy and his foreign policy. All right, keep this in mind. All right, very keep it in mind. I mean, despite in Paris, tens of thousands of people just died in the streets, but it was a really bloody revolution and rebellion against again in 1848. The amount of victims to come to revolution to overthrow a cause or to bring forth in France up to this point resulted in well over hundreds of thousands of people. Unreal. That we know of. Okay? That we know of. Now, the Austrian Revolution, when you look at Austrian history, becomes the Austrian Revolution. Let's start talking about that. Because this was a widespread uprising right across the multi-ethnic empire, which is the Habsburg Empire, which takes March 1848 to about November 1949. So this goes on a very long time within the Austrian-Hungarian or the Austrian Empire. Now, this was driven by pretty much a mostly democratic, liberal reforms and strong nationalistic desires for self-autonomy and independence from Vienna, especially by the Czechs, the Hungarians, the Italians. Okay, they were all, and plus also the demanding for social change and everything like that. Now, this leads to a changing event in European history because one of the most architects of the system and of the conservative old world order is actually resigns. Because this leads to the fall of the Chancellor Metternich. Alright, now he's the Austrian Chancellor. He is one of the architects of the old conservative system, the Holy Alliance between the empires and the monarchies of Eastern and Central Europe against the ideals of the French Revolution, socialism, liberalism, constitutional monarchy, the new world compared to the old world. he is ultimately eliminated and crushed by imperial forces eventually. But the good thing about it is within the Austrian Empire is that they do abolish serfdom. Okay, but the thing is, when they do that, this actually spawns deeper national identities because their chains are broke. Now they're free to mingle. So, and they're like, well, we can get away with that. Right? Now, serfdom doesn't get abolished in Russia until Alexander. Tsar Alexander III. So, alright, we're not going to talk that because I'll just go right into it on a rabbit hole for me. Because I love talking about Russian history. So, now, the main causes of what happens in the Austrian Revolution of 1848 to 1849 is very substantial, okay? The demands for constitution, free press, freedom overall, everything that stemmed to the French Revolution, all right? They wanted to destabilize the central government. They wanted more self-autonomy, especially the Hungarians. The Hungarians are going to be the ones that actually change everything, okay? Because it all starts with the Vienna Uprising in March the 13th, 1848. And demonstrations actually lead to the resignation of the chancellor at this time, okay, Metternich, because he can't do it. He brings forth temporary liberal reforms like freedom of press, or press freedom, some people say, I don't know why, but anyway, freedom of press, and this just wears at him and he's forced to step down. He can't do it anymore. He lost. Things needed to change. And this led to the Hungarian revolt within the empire. Now, what do you think they thought? They thought more for self and their own constitution and autonomy, separate from the Austrians. But there was going to be a deal made. Okay? But this led conflict with Vienna. Now, well, who is the Austrians going to ask for help? The spearhead, right? They're going to ask help from the Russians because the Russians are conservative. They're like, well, they crushed every kind of liberal reform aspect ever since the December's revolt in 1825, and everything after that was just totally suppressed within the Russian Empire. And Nicholas comes and saves the day. And Alexander II does actually eventually come too, but this is Nicholas. Nicholas I is a magnificent czar when he comes into power in 1825. Okay, so he does all this. So he's going to come and save. But we're going to put a pause to that right now because at this time you have the Italian uprisings also within the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Keep this noted very well, okay? Because Milan and Venice rebel against Austrian rule. Now, this sets forth the first Italian War of Independence, okay, against Austrian rule in the two regions of Lombardy and Veneto. So, in those two regions. Now, you have this going within the empire, which is huge. Now, this is going to be affected later on in the industrial or the Italian unification. It's all connected. Remember, history's a spider web. There's so much to cover here. So much. It's so amazing how much we're missing. But, anywho's. Alright. Now, Emperor Ferdinand I abdicated. Now, he was replaced with the final. Franz Joseph I becomes emperor. Now, he becomes emperor all the way up until... Let's find out. We'll get there. So... he wants to restore imperial power. So he calls in for reinforcements. He's going all the way that possibly he can go. He's going to call to crush these revolts. So the Russians come to their aid. Alright? Oh yeah, especially suppress the Hungarian revolutions, the Croats, everybody. That's... oh yeah, crushes the entire revolutions. There's a war happening within the Austrian Empire. Alright? Now, by late 1849, all these are suppressed, and pretty much conservative rule is restored. Imperial rule is restored by the help of the Russians. This is where Russia really gets established on the international theater, especially a main player on the European stage, and is really recognized as the bearer of conservative values. No pun intended. Okay? So they are very advocate towards it. They are the guiding hand for the old world order. The defender. Strong defender. This is Mother Russia, like a mother bear, defending its cubs of absolutism, serfdom, all right, and imperial power, right? So, but either or, okay? The revolutions themselves were just magnificent. And for the Habsburgs, it was a total struggle against nationalism. And to try to keep such a multi-ethnical empire together was a struggle. They got sick with nationalism, but they actually had to get a vaccine. The Russian vaccine had to come and save them with their extra antibodies. Remember, they are right? They're the anti-coalition against liberalism and nationalism and socialism. Right? So they are the antibodies, if you want to metaphorically compare it, which I like to do a lot when it comes in my history. Now, how this is important, it sets the stage, because this is when nationalism becomes more aggressive. Now, the liberals did win a little bit of victories, but the old conservative order kind of wiped those off the slate, cleared the table again. It's like, what are you putting this shit on my table for? Get it off. Russia comes and saves the day. Okay? Now, the failure of the revolutions, especially in Austria, and how this actually relates, it fosters for decades, okay, the nationalist, like, question, all right? The nationalities question. And it really fosters for decades and decades, right up to the First World War. And this is where it really starts to take off more aggressive. This is where more aggressive matters start to take place. You're going to see that in June the 28th, 1914. This is what it leads up to. Because they realized a lot of the liberals, a lot of the nationalists become extremists by this point after 1948. And there's more assassination attempts, there is more killings, there's more sabotage, espionage, there is more not hitting, revolting in the streets and getting slaughtered. Everything starts to change. We got to cut the head off the snake. This is where this idea starts to happen after this, especially in this part of European history. I love Eastern European and Central history. Central and Eastern European history is my studies. And Russia is my studies. But a lot of it I just love. I love it. And this is what starts to take place. All right? Then you have so many movements giving forth, right? Now, the first major movement doesn't take place until 1867. And the thing is, we'll get to that in time. Okay? That comes up later on. 1867 is a very important world event year, I would say, in a lot of things. Canada becomes a nation. Alaska is bought by the United States from the Russian Empire. But most importantly, what happens in March March the 30th, 1867. This becomes the formation of the Austrian and the Hungarian Empire is formed. Those two bodies come together and keep the empire in check. The two majorities, right? Remember, they did get their constitution. They did have their self-governing body, but still part of the empire. But this is where the two crowns joined on March the 30th, 1867, to become the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. All right? It was pretty much, this is the effects of that. It sets the stage for this empire, but it's very, very weak and hold it together, not by duct tape, by thread. One little and she all falls apart like a house of cards. All right, it doesn't take much to blow off a house of cards, and this is what it really comes to. And eventually, it leads up to the catalysis of what happens in June the 28th, 1914, with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand by the Serbian nationalists. Right? We can all remember that. Now, that's how it really important starts to go up until, we'll learn, up until the French, well, up until the beginning of World War I. Okay? So, but other revolutions at this time, like in Belgium, Netherlands, and Denmark, they actually all manifested itself into revolutions that became pretty peaceful, with reforms and existing institutions, and democratic insurrections broke out in the capitals of all of those three great monarchies. There's monarchy in Belgium, monarchy in the Netherlands, monarchy in Denmark. Now, the thing is, the capitals of these great monarchs, okay? You had Paris, Vienna, you had all these, okay? You had them all. They were all there. Now, they were powerless in their fear, especially in the Netherlands and Belgium and Denmark. The fear of revolution, they did very little to defend themselves. As monarchs, they didn't do anything. Constitutional monarchies were established, because even in these countries today, you still have monarchies as a symbol of their history and their pride. But one thing was important, which takes place in what happens in Denmark. All right, and we know a little bit about what happened in Belgium in 1930, right? Wicked, right? And a little bit of the Netherlands. The Belgians want to get off and throw off Dutch rule. Well, the 3 Years' War, okay, is very important. It takes place at this time. Okay, so the 3 Years' War, or the First Schleswig War, takes place between Denmark and Germany. Now, this is the first. Now, most people in high school, you'll learn about one of the two. But this is the first. This is where she all starts. And the first war actually is 1848 to 1852. The First Schleswig War over Schleswig and Holstein, these two regions that were fought between Germany and Denmark. Now, a lot of German minority lived in these areas, but Denmark controlled them. So, this is where nationalism has its thing. Now, what is funny is what actually takes place. All right? Now, the Danish nationalists had desires to incorporate Schleswig into Denmark. All right? This is not like today where Denmark's trying to hold off Greenland from United States invasion. All right? This is a little bit more of international national desires. But because of their nationalism, that's why they're so strong and able to hold on. And they're like, Greenland is not for sale, and we're not giving it up. It's part of the Danish kingdom, or the Danish Republic. All right? The Danish kingdom. So, now during this time, the German Confederation started to form. We'll learn more about this later on when we learn about German unification. But at this time, we're going to look at the Danish side, because they're trying to bring this in and incorporate this area in the whole. But there's so many Germans that want to be part of Germany. What do you do with territories like this? We have this in modern time. All right? It consistently happens, right? In many parts of the world. Like when we're in Kosovo. All right? What? Kosovo's got like a lot of Serbs in it. Then all of a sudden, you're in Kosovo. We don't solve anything. Like what's going on in the Middle East, Palestinians and Israelites. We haven't learned. Because naturally with nationalism is there now. It ain't going away like COVID. There's no cure. Is there a cure for nationalism? Nationalism is a disease incorporated to certain things like empires or imperialists or monarchies. It is very cancerous towards targeted audience like empires, right? Now, here's the thing During the First War, believe it or not, it's a Danish victory. You're like, what? No. Yes, it is. Historically, this is one of Denmark's greatest victories on the battlefield. They actually do have a Danish victory because of European backing. They don't do it on their own against the Germans at this point, or the German Confederation. They can't do that. They would have lost. But they did have European backing. But on the battlefield, they actually performed really well against the Prussians. And the thing is, the Prussians were naturally military-based and just dug into their blood. And they're like the Spartans of modern Europe. And in a lot of aspects. But the problem is, after the war in 1852, what do you think is going to happen? It leaves a lot of unresolved issues, right? Now, the 3 Years' War is something else, all right? Now, if you really want to know the dates, I can remember them on the top of my head. March the 24th, 1848, and May the 8th, 1852. Don't quote me on those. But this is how long that war lasts. 3 Years' War. And the thing is, one thing in history, too, there's a lot of questions. And this is something you might, if you read anything about it, it comes to Zwig-Holstein question. There's a lot of questions in history. The Jewish question, the peasant question, the Polish question, the Eastern question. These are things that always pop up. The communist question. There's so many of these questions in modern history, and this was one of the things that people said, what are we going to do about this question? Because when they say a question needs an answer. And they didn't really have an answer for this question, all right? Now, these two duchies are going to be fought between two powers. Well, I wouldn't say powers, but two states. Germany, which is not unified, it's the German Confederation. And then you had Denmark, the kingdom. So, it's kind of, the Danish crown and Danish massive victory with European support upon this time. And both nationalist movements within the two countries are going to duke it out again. Because this ain't resolved, and Germany is not going to let this go. And one man ain't going to forget about it when he comes up. Otto von Bismarck. He's going to be like, Now he's going to use this as a perfect tool for unification. All right? In his view of nationalism and unification of the German people. All right? Later on. So, you had Denmark versus the German Confederation, which was pretty much led by Prussia and Austria. They were the two powerhouses of the German Confederation. So, this was a Danish victory. Even in Denmark today, in a lot of aspects, they celebrate this. All right? It's the Battle of Boom, which takes place during this war, which was the major one. The whole rebellion was against Danish rule. And the Danes come out as victorious to keep these two duchies in part of the Kingdom of Denmark. And after that battle, which was a huge, shocking, if you think about it, Denmark wins at wars? Back in the Viking time, we know. But in modern history, this is one of their major victories. And they really, hold it dear a lot to themselves for this. But despite all that, the Battle of Zygwig was another major victory, too, for the Danes, because they're like, whoa, we're winning on the battlefield, we're winning on the democratic front, we're winning on the diplomacy front, foreign affairs front, and the military front. And politically and socially, they're not really winning because these two areas were revolting to join the German Confederation. That was a problem, all right? Now, this led to pretty much the armistice of parting, my language here, momentum, okay? M-A-L-O-M, or O-M-O, sorry, okay? Now, militarily, Denmark did win this. Huge, all right? A lot of people, but after everything was said and done and the armistice was signed and the treaties was introduced, it didn't solve any issues. Nationalism was still there. It was still fostered among the German citizens that were still under Danish rule. This became a very big problem. Very big problem. Alright? So this eventually leads later on to everything that actually happens. So it's pretty interesting how it actually takes place, because this is going to come up even towards the First World War again and on the final steps of all that happening. So basically how it all takes place. Alright? So in the next episode, we're actually going to get into the Italian unification and its sense of nationalism, okay? So we're going to get into that, and, it's going to be a lot to get into the Italian unification. There's a lot to it. It's going to be a couple episodes, I can imagine, just to get the basics. We're just going through the basics of nationalism as the causes, right up until you see how it's all going to be linked at the end of it. Now this is where you're going to have to come up and start. Okay, I remember that. This is where you're going to know you're actually learning and absorbing knowledge. Most people can do that. Everybody has the ability to do that, but it's up to them to choose if they do or not. So until then, that's what we're going to do. But so the next episode, which is going to be an Italian unification, we're going to get right into that, because that's one of my favorite things to study. I studied a lot of it. And I love the war, too. As in this episode, I will commentary on this. Is basically the revolutions that took place across Europe. There's many reasons, okay? There's a lot. There has been multitude of a series of books just written on these revolutions that took place in 1848. And really started in Sicily and France in February of 1848. And because of everything that happened in the 40s, you see a cause and effect, right? And one of the greatest effects is those failed harvests that had economic problems to it, and mass starvation and migration of ideas. And one thing is important to remember, you got to think and you gotta comprehend, is even the Irish potato famine. All of these people, where did they come to? Your ancestors. If you're born and raised Canadian for generations, move to Canada, move to the States, move to the New World. They just didn't bring their physical selves. They also brought their philosophies, their ideologies, their beliefs, their morals, their lessons, and who they were as a culture to this new world. But mostly, regardless of culture, liberalism, socialism, nationalism can affect anybody, right? So they brought it all to the New World on a massive scale. It was already in the New World even since the American Revolution, but now you had on NASA. Here's another surge of drugs, of dopamine, if you will, to the brain of the New World. We got it all up. We're good, right? So this is how it all goes. One thing is love history, okay? I love history. So this is cool how it all works out. And with all these little wars, there's so many little wars that happens. There's going to be another series that I'm going to be doing. It's alliances, assassinations, and crises. But that I'm pretty much putting together now, trying to build, and which is the second series into the causes of the origins of the First World War. Now, okay? We're going to look at how alliances formed, what was a part of these alliances, and if you remember everything so far up to this, in this nationalism series, I don't have to explain it in the next series, because you got to remember it, put it into this series. You're putting building blocks. Alright? It's the same thing in university. You learn all this and you come take another course, it's like, whoa, there's more to the puzzle. I'm starting to see the whole picture. Right? Try to get the whole picture into one thing, but there's so much to it, and when you love history, and one of my major weaknesses is shortening things. So, there's so much. Because every time I'm sitting in class, I always have all these questions. Well, what was that? Where did that come from? What did they do in Russia at this time? You know, and be like, well, we're not talking about Russia, but yeah, we just did mention a little bit of Russia, but why would they do that? I always needed to expand. Call it a drug, call it a disease, call it what you wish. It's what it is. But anyways. But until next time, take care. This is John the Historian, and always remember, history is also full of morals and lessons, no matter what it is. The lessons that are taught in this is, what do you think of the French or the Austrians? The ability to fight. It may, for liberalism and socialism and nationalism itself, among the the ethnicities of those empires, especially the Austrians, they kept trying, and eventually they did fail. It succeeded, it grew a little bit, but the environment couldn't keep its growth going. It stagnated it, and it died. In life, we'll have those, but eventually, if you keep seeding, eventually one of those seeds in the right environment will come, and conditions, and it will sprout. Right? So, never give up on a lot of things. But anyway, until next time, we're going to talk about the Italian unification, which is going to be awesome. And we're going to talk about the German unification. And then we're going to talk about what happened between 1870 and 1914. Nationalist movements during that time. Before we get into basically the First World War. But anyway. But there's a lot to it. And this is my first time doing this series. I can imagine as a historian, in a few years, I'm going to remaster the series and make it better, but I'm putting it right there now. That's why I need comments and commentary to make myself better, criticism, what's good, what's not, what I should do. I know that I got to modernize it with videos and pictures, and, I feel sometimes like I'm the philosophers of Greece sitting on a stone in a temple or outside around pillars and talking to students about there's no pictures and lights and cameras. And that's why they were just as smart as people today that do it. So, I don't know. But anyways, give me those, subscribe, like, comment. Don't be shy. I'm not going to hurt you. I'm not going to judge. Alright? Like it says in the Bible, judge is not to be judged. So, let her out there, okay? Until next time, this is Johnny the Historian. Learn your daily history.